going to wait for you to take your seats, and then we're going to start.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. Yes, so this. Wow, look at full house.
Full house.
Lots of ladies. Yes? The microphone? Do you want to bring it down a little bit?
Is mine okay?
Oh. Okay. Great, thanks. Good morning. And
Good
welcome
morning.
to our Fireside Talk. My name is Youmna Naufal. I'm the producer and host of YChats. I want to start by thanking newly appointed Minister Dr. Meshi Diat for always putting women on the front line, but also on the forefront. So thank you so much for these amazing talks. She's going strong. This conference has been going on for a couple years now, and it doesn't seem to cease, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. And thank you all for being here with us. We have the utmost pleasure today to welcome in Beirut author Miss Lucy Hawking. She has made science accessible and entertaining through her George book series of 6 adventure novels based on real science for young readers. Written in collaboration with world-leading scientists, the George series is published in over 40 languages. She is also a trustee of the Autism Research Trust and chairperson of the Stephen Hawking Foundation, named after renowned scientist Stephen Hawking, of course, being her late father. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Miss Lucy Hawking.
Thank you.
So, hi.
Hi. And I just want to say I'm so delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank May for inviting me. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here with you all this morning. So thank you all.
We're happy. We're happy you're here. We've got a lot of questions.
We've got a lot to cover. Whole universe.
Yes. Putting science and education was very important to you. It was very important to make science accessible, which a lot of people usually get scared of, because when we think science, or we're taught to think, when we think science, we think, ooh, complex, I don't want to go there. But you've made it accessible. Why was that important to you?
Well, the lives we lead now already are dominated by science and technology. And in the future, it's going to be even more so. So for those who are young today, really need to have a way in. They need to have an understanding of basic scientific concepts, because otherwise they're going to be very disenfranchised in a future which will be based on science, will be based on technology. And I want kids to develop those foundational skills that science gives in education of critical thinking, how to disaggregate a problem, how to frame an argument, how to look at statistics, and ultimately to be able to look at what you're being told and work out for yourself whether it's true. And if kids can't do that, then they could become very vulnerable as they grow up. Just imagine somebody going around saying climate change is not man-made.
There are people saying that.
People saying something like that. And you need to have the skills to be able to evaluate what you're being told. And I think science and education does that in such a terrific way. But I also just wanted to make it fun. I realized that a lot of kids were distanced from science because they weren't being told essentially what the relevance between them and science is. They sort of saw science as this completely separate thing. Rather than viewing it as an activity done by human beings, they saw it as something separate, something very other. I've got a book of pictures drawn by children of scientists, and all the scientists have huge heads, wearing white lab coats. They're all men, and they're all on their own doing a dangerous experiment. And that doesn't really encourage a vast number of the school population to think, oh, I could be a scientist.
And I find it interesting that you mention, scientists, and they're all men, because when we think of science, and I know we talked a lot about women in STEM in recent years. I remember Melinda Gates saying that you have to push them young. But why do you think women are not seen, are not taken seriously in a very male-dominated industry?
Well, I mean, of course, historically...
How do we change that perception?
Right. Historically, there have always been great women scientists, but I don't think it's unfair to say that the men have been better at self-promotion. If you look at Rosalind Franklin, who was not cited for a Nobel Prize, then I think that a lot of really important work has been done by women, but in general, the glory has been taken by men. And one thing that I think is really fantastic now is you've got a lot of brilliant female scientists are sort of coming forward. They're being more covered, they're being better covered in the media, they're telling their stories. And this provides role models for girls who want to go into science. Because I work with kids, I'm often told by young girls, well, I don't know who to look up to.
Yeah.
And now that's, for example, NASA have just announced that there will be, in March, there will be the first all-female spacewalk. Now
Yeah.
that's really inspiring stuff for young girls who could think, oh, no, I could be an astronaut.
Mm-hmm.
I could be an engineer. I could do all these amazing things because they're now seeing women undertaking these roles.
We can't mention science without mentioning your father, renowned scientist, and I need to say this correctly, theoretical physicist,
You got
the
it right.
late legendary Stephen Hawking. What was it like, because I know you've accompanied him throughout his brilliant career, working alongside him since you were young. What was it like being his daughter?
Well, I once heard an astronaut talking about what it's like to live in space.
Yeah.
And he said, it's both extremely ordinary and extremely extraordinary at the same time. And I suddenly thought, actually, that's a really good description of what it was like living with my dad. Because you do a lot of really ordinary things because day-to-day life goes on. But on the other hand, it was all completely extraordinary at the same time.
Not only was it extraordinary because of what he accomplished vis-a-vis black holes, vis-a-vis science, but I know that, and this is a very dear cause to your heart, having to be by his side throughout his disability. Stephen Hawking was diagnosed with ALS when he was 21. He was given a few years to live, but he challenged whatever they predicted and lived over 50 years.
Yes.
And I know that in society, that's still, it's still a taboo and it's still stigmatized to people with disabilities. I know in Lebanon, for example, it's not a very disability-friendly country.
Well, one of the really extraordinary things about my father was that he was a profoundly disabled person who excelled in his field. And he was really one of the first people with such an advanced disability to work on since the age of 21, he was consistently employed. He was never out of work. Now, that is not the experience of most people with a disability. Unfortunately, inclusion rates in the workplace for people with disabilities is very, very low. And one thing I'm incredibly proud of my father for is the fact that he showed that his disability was not linked in any way to his potential, that he could do all these extraordinary things and he wasn't going to allow himself to be limited. And I just have to say how much I admire May as well. I find a lot of similarities between May and my father.
I think it's not only is it extraordinary to have an extraordinary mind, but also to be able to, despite whatever challenges you're going through, be it physical or moral, to overcome them, to achieve a greater goal, which is what your father...
I was discussing this with May yesterday, how my father was a sharp-dressed man. He ordered his suits from a tailor in Italy. He wore cravats. He was always wanting someone to come and have his hair cut. Even right to the end of his life, he insisted on being clean-shaven. He was well turned out. He had dignity, and he presented himself. And that was really important to him. That was a really important part of his being.
There's probably a lot of expectations when you're the daughter of Stephen Hawking, and his legacy is immense. So what have you taken from him?
I think there's the scientific legacy, his genius, his brilliance, his outreach, the way that he really started this idea of somebody who is not part of the scientific community, who doesn't have an advanced education, can and should still engage with the big questions of science. And he thought that was really important because he felt the work of scientists shouldn't just be confined to university campuses and sort of traded among people who could speak to each other in terms that nobody else would understand. So that, I think, he started this idea of the general population engaging with science. Brief History of Time is the first popular science book. It really didn't exist in that framework before. And then I think his bravery and his courage, his ability to keep going, his defiance, his stubbornness, which was sometimes a nuisance, I have to say. Sometimes it was like, no, I really don't think you should do that. I mean, I really don't think that's a good idea. And off he'd go and do it anyway. So, yeah, there's so much to say about him, that he's one of those people who, despite the fact he used the word brief all the time, brief history, brief answers, it's remarkably hard to be brief when talking about him.
He was actually born
and I love you
on
said
the
this yesterday. I got
death date of Galileo,
That's right.
and he died on the birthday of Albert Einstein.
That's
Talk
right.
about synchronicity.
I know. And When I realized that the day my father had passed away was also Albert Einstein's birthday, the first thing that went through my mind was, well, that's just typical of him. It's just this sort of classy, graceful exit. Quite extraordinary.
We talk about his passing, which was actually almost a year ago to the date.
Almost a year ago, yes.
And I know that before coming here, you were part of a conference where you talked about the possibility of him coming back through virtual reality. And I know AI was huge for him, and artificial intelligence, and I'm sure you get that question a lot, but I need to ask it. We shouldn't be afraid of artificial intelligence. It should be compatible with humanity. But what is it about this virtual reality where children will be able to actually go in space with Stephen Hawking inside black holes?
Before my father passed away, he was working on a project to create an immersive experience so that you go into a black hole, so effectively you fall into a black hole accompanied by him. Now, obviously, after he died, we put this project to one side, but we have now launched it. We feel that this is a good time and that it is something he wanted to do. He was always looking for the most evocative, the most exciting, the most entertaining way you could explain complex concepts to a general audience. And of course, young people love VR experiences, and so we felt this was a really appropriate project to carry on with.
And the black holes, let's answer this question. This was really something he worked on. It was the whole movie, The Theory of Everything, which won an Oscar for Eddie Redmayne, was based on how he discovered exactly how I'm not a scientist, as you can see, how two black holes come together. The colliding black holes was a very elegant mathematical proof that he worked out in 1970, just a few days after I was born. So I always like to think I was a really inspirational baby. But in fact, his later work on black holes is more important. His discovery that black holes are not as black as they've been painted, because before then it was thought that nothing ever came out of a black hole, and my father realized that they emit radiation. They do, and I know children ask you this question a lot, and you have a very nice answer. What happens if we enter a black hole?
You'd be torn into spaghetti.
Spaghetti. He passed March of last year, and in October, about 6-7 months after his passing, you released a book called Brief Answers to the Big Questions.
That's right.
And I want to ask a few of those big questions. I know. Why are we here?
Why are we here? I don't think that crops up in the book quite in that framework.
How do we shape the future, and why are we here?
Oh, I see what you mean. I'm sorry, I was thinking...
Oh, no, not why are we here today. We're here today because Dr. Meishidiat invited us. No, why are we on this... I'm sorry.
You really threw me with that one.
I was like, was I reading the wrong book? Sorry. I was like, no.
There's a very interesting chapter about how do we shape the future, which again focuses on what we've been discussing today, which is equal opportunity access to education for kids, the foundational importance of kids understanding science, but also the importance of people tackling the big questions, people being prepared to have a go at understanding the work of my father and his colleagues and how important he sees that. His whole thing is he wants people to keep asking questions. He doesn't want people to shy away from these great existential matters, but he wants people to engage because it's interesting, because it's meaningful, and because he feels ultimately everybody has something to gain if we question our existence on planet Earth and where we are going as a species. I mean, a lot of his writing is about that. When you talk about why are we here, then that's not really a question that anybody has a neat answer to. We don't really know how life began on Earth.
Right, he talks about the Big Bang and then how that started everything. It gets
right.
very scientific.
Very, very scientific. And the Big Bang, and obviously the end result of that being the formation of stars, galaxies, planets, and eventually us. And here we are. And does it have any meaning, or are we purely an accident? Are we just a byproduct of this universe, or are we here for some purpose?
Right, and I think that especially the way he lived his life, shows that it's all about purpose at the end of the day.
I
Having a purpose and looking for a purpose.
Personally having a purpose and and thinking that you are part of a divine plan and a purpose is a very different thing. I think he thought that you had to make every minute count as somebody who didn't know. You know, it was all about time for him. He didn't know how long he had.
I know we might get asked this from the audience, but I want to ask it to allow other questions. A big question that he was probably asked a lot, and I know you do as well, is the possibility of alien or extraterrestrial life. And I love this because you said yesterday, even though he was a bit like, the fear is, oh, they're going to come and take over our planet. And you said, no, if there is outside intelligence, maybe they can help us. So can you elaborate on that?
Well, that's right. My father rather famously said, we shouldn't try and contact aliens because they might be so much more advanced than us. And in his view, that wouldn't actually be that hard. Then they could come and we could really suffer as a result. But I like to think that if aliens were super advanced and they came here, maybe they could help us fix some of the problems we are experiencing. If they have a far more advanced civilization than us, presumably they will have gone through some of the problems that face us, which are global. I mean, our challenges are not local anymore. They are global.
Especially in the interconnected world that we're in.
In the interconnected world, but I think one thing that is a great concern, was I think something we talked about yesterday, and something I always show kids is an image, is how astronauts see the Earth from space, and they see the unity, they see the image, one planet, one human race, and that really helps to fix in kids' minds that we are all sharing the same habitat, and that we need to take care of it. Another of the great lessons of space exploration is how inhospitable the other planets of the solar system are. I mean, we talk about sending astronauts to Mars, but that's a very difficult environment, and we have absolutely no guarantee that astronauts have any real survival rate on the red planet. And so when we look around at these other planets and we sort of evaluate them, we really understand how special the Earth is and how we need to be taking better care of it than we are.
It's almost sad to think that you need to leave the Earth in order to realize how important it is.
That's right, and that is a very interesting thing
We
that
take it for
astronauts say
granted.
we always think of space travelers going away from the planet, but there's a very profound thing about looking back and the realizations, the perspective that the space age has given us on our planet.
It is all about perspective. I want to take 2 questions from the audience and then finalize this talk. Does anybody have any questions for Mrs. Lucy Hawking?
Oh, we have a lady there.
Oh, yes. The lady in the... Do we have a microphone ready? I know alien is a big one because I got asked that. Are you going to ask her about aliens?
I get whenever
Are they going to take over?
I do a lot of talks to kids and aliens come up every single time. So much so that actually in one of the books I wrote with my father, we actually write about how to talk to aliens. We're very practical in these books, by the way. We give you lots of really helpful
advice. How do you talk to aliens?
Well, you see, it's difficult to try and work out what the mutual... Oh, sorry, we're leaving the lady.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. We can hear you.
I don't know, where is the microphone? If you could please introduce yourself and then ask your question. Thank you.
Noura Merabi.
Hello.
Founder of Brave Foundation. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. May for this opportunity. Secondly, being a daughter of such an important figure must have been very, very overwhelming as having a childhood experience. So I wanted to know, what was your first stereotype that you had to deal with when you were young, very young?
Well, actually, I didn't have to deal with fame as a child, which I'm extremely grateful for. My father didn't become well known until I was about 18, because he didn't become world famous until the publication of Brief History of Time. So from that point of view, I did not have to manage fame as a child. However, my father was already profoundly disabled and yet living an independent life at that time, which was extremely unusual. So he had an electric wheelchair, he had a job, he had a spouse, he had children. He was autonomous, he went where he wanted, he went to work, he came back. And people just couldn't cope with it. People in the street were so unused to seeing a disabled person out and about by themselves that they would just sort of drop their shopping and stand and like stare at us with open mouths. And I found that very intrusive. And it made me very sad as a child, because this experience of just being stared at. I've told this story a lot, but it's always worth repeating, that when I was a child, we went into a restaurant with my mother and my brother and I, and we started having our meal, and the manager came over and told my mother that we would have to leave the restaurant because other customers did not want to eat their food in the same place as my father. And so one thing, I'm super proud of my father and of May for pushing back for this pioneering work around disability, that disabled people, that segregation for people with disabilities is completely unacceptable. I hope nothing like that would ever happen now, but I do think in certain areas disability is still highly stigmatized and people can find themselves very isolated.
Yeah, and more power to you for actually having to overcome that and live with that. And I know it's a personal thing for you because your son as well, you talk about that.
That's right. My son has autism, and so I also have the dual experience of bringing up a child with disabilities. And unfortunately, disabilities, both physical and learning disabilities, are still highly stigmatized. And I have been on the end of some really extraordinary comments to me in the UK about that my son having autism is a karmic judgment, or that clearly I didn't love him enough when he was a baby. And if there's one thing I'd really like to clear away, it is this stigmatization, this demonization, the isolation, and it really does impact women, because very often it's women who are left to bring up children with disabilities on their own, and they can be absolutely shunned by society and left out. And I think that's an issue that doesn't really get talked about very much. So I'm very grateful to May for allowing me to air that view here on this platform.
Thank you for being here and sharing that. Thank you. We're gonna go to Jackie Malouf.
Thank you. Jackie Malouf, founder and president of the National Diabetes Organization.
Hello.
I can't tell you how happy I am to hear all these inspirational talks today. And Lucy, we were talking outside. I would like, if you can, please share with the audience how it is to feel with somebody at home suffering or living with something on a day-to-day basis without really feeling what this person is feeling. Being a mother of a daughter with type 1 diabetes, not to compare diabetes to other things, but still it's a condition on day-to-day struggle. So I would like you to share with the audience how powerful it is, like to feel frustrated sometimes. You want to be, instead of the person you love, living that disease or living that disability, and you cannot. So as much as we say, we do understand, I understand my daughter, you understand your son, you understood your father, it's never the same, but at least we try. So please tell them more about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we were having a very interesting conversation about outside, about how if we could, we would take on the suffering of other people, but that's not open to us. And I was just explaining that my father suffered far more than he ever let on. And frankly, that he didn't want people to know, but he did. His life was really hard work. He was ventilated. He had to communicate through using a speech machine, which he twitched the muscles on his cheek in order to operate. And so his dedication and his commitment to overcoming his disability was extraordinary. And yet, that wasn't what he wanted people to think of him. So as a close relative, it puts you in a paradoxical position of sometimes feeling like you're perhaps intervening in the wrong way, sometimes feeling like you might have said or done the wrong thing because you're living with something that you can't really reference and you can't understand, but yet it's always there and you're very aware of the struggle and the courage and the depth of suffering. And I think, again, not enough, certainly mothers of children, have a forum in which to express how difficult and challenging things can be for them, and to just talk to each other and be able to share experiences. Thank you.
I think When we speak of scientists, we speak of Albert Einstein, we speak of Newton, and we speak of Stephen Hawking. He was the example of a brilliant mind, unwilling to be fettered by a frail body. And I love because in one of his last speeches, accepting an award, he said, at the end of the day, there are no boundaries. And I think he meant it in every possible way.
Every way, yes.
And so sky is the limit, or space.
Space, why stop at the sky? Go
And
further.
on that note, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This was a fireside talk with Lucy Stephen Hawking. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.